David Linden.
Thank you very much, and good morning, Secretary of State.
Good morning.
Let's start with a very simple yes-no question. Do you believe in evidence-based policy?
Well, it would be rather odd if I said I didn't, wouldn't it?
Good. Excellent.
Yes. So I think you can safely know the answer to that first question. Yes.
Okay. So over the course of the last while, the committee has taken evidence from a number of people, think tanks, academics, on conditionality. Dr. Katie Jones said they didn't work. The IFS have said on sanctions, as a result, and I quote, "The policy produces fiscal savings indistinguishable from zero. Furthermore, we find negative effects on the mental health of individuals who remained out of work, though positive effects for those pushed into work." Indeed, even the Conservative think tank Bright Blue published a report last year pointing out the inadequacy of the current levels of social security payments and advocating, and again I quote, "a benchmark should be set under which benefits cannot fall below even if a sanction was applied to their recipient." They're all right. Sanctions don't work, do they?
No, I disagree with that.
Why?
Well, because there is evidence, and I'm happy to write to the committee on that matter, that is the case. I think also I would question, and I don't know the specific details of the people that you've raised and the work that they've conducted, but it is typically the case that one of the things that is not considered when looking at whether they're answering the question whether sanctions are effective or not is the deterrent effect that sanctions have over a wider audience of those who are not at any point themselves sanctioned. So that's the first point. I think the second point is that, and I think most people would feel this was reasonable, that if somebody is in a position where they're able to work, they're being offered support, they're being provided with support through the benefits system, and, for example, they are failing to turn up to appointments with a work coach. And we're not talking about appointments every day, we're talking about periodic appointments with a work coach, and that is the source of over 97% of the current sanctions in operation. Then it's not unreasonable for there to be some form of consequence for that. On the point of conditionality that you raised, David, at the beginning, I mean, conditionality has been a feature of the welfare and benefits system, the employment benefits regime, since the founding of the welfare state. This is nothing that's new. And once again, when we use this term conditionality, you can see it, and perhaps that's the way you're projecting it today, as something that is onerous and perhaps potentially unnecessary and unreasonable. But, I don't see it that way. I see it as support. And I think the things that we've been already in this session discussing, for example, work well and bringing in the appropriate medical support alongside work and universal support, helping people into work and keeping them into work by liaising with them and having staff to do that. I think that those are all hallmarks of a caring society that wants the best for people. And so when I hear the word conditionality, that's what I hear, rather than something that's unnecessary and unreasonable. But on sanctions, just to get back to that, because I think this is a really important point, a sanction is only applied where something that is really basically unreasonable and was avoidable on the part of the customer has occurred. Where a sanction may otherwise occur, but there is a perfectly reasonable reason why, for example, somebody didn't attend a particular work coach session, then that is taken into account, and work coaches have discretion not to apply or seek a sanction. The sanction themselves work through a process whereby the work coach refers the possibility of a sanction to a decision taker. So that's somebody who's independent of that interaction between the work coach and the claimant. There is the potential for an appeal against a sanction to an independent tribunal, and there is a hardship fund available for those who are sanctioned and as a consequence of the sanction find themselves in a very difficult financial situation. So I'm satisfied overall, and inevitably in a vast system with many of these kind of interactions happening, I'm not saying it's entirely perfect and it never will be, but I think the fundamental principles and the processes that are employed here are pretty right, actually.
You mentioned earlier on that you'd been out to see some stuff in Birmingham, and you're a Secretary of State that generally gets out and manages to visit job centres and organisations. When was the last time you met someone who had been sanctioned at that point?
I think the honest answer to that is I'm not sure that I can recollect when I might have met somebody who has
You
been
ever met
sanctioned.
anybody who's been
But I
sanctioned?
what I would say is I have been to job
Just a
centres.
yes/no answer question. Have you met somebody?
Sorry.
It's just a yes/no question. Have you ever met somebody who's
I
been
don't
sanctioned?
actually know, but the level of sanctions is currently about 6%. It was prior to the pandemic about 3%.
Can I just confirm
So,
though, you've never had interaction with somebody who has actually been sanctioned?
I don't know, because when I've met those that are going through the system, I wouldn't typically say, oh, my name's Mel Stride, I'm the Secretary of State, have you been sanctioned? So I don't know the answer to that, I'm afraid.
Okay, do you know how much the average amount is that someone loses when they're sanctioned?
I think maybe we... Catherine,
So I'm asking you, sorry, Secretary of State, I'm asking you the question.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Off the top of my head, I wouldn't know what the average is, and I don't...
Pounds.
And I don't know... Can I...
No, sorry, so it's £600.
Yes.
So if someone's starting from a standing start where they only receive state support, right, they're not incredibly wealthy, perhaps like yourself, and you remove all of that state support from them, what then happens at that stage, Secretary of State?
Well, as I say, there is a hardship fund. There is a measured and proportionate approach that is taken within the system as to whether a sanction is applied in the first place. The sanction applies, as you know, to the standard allowance, not to the other elements of universal credit. And could I also make the point that when we talk about sanctions, they are there for the purpose of trying to have a system that ultimately ends up with more people going into work and work being the way out of the kind of difficulties and pressures that you're rightly describing.
Yeah, so you've pretty much conceded this morning that you've never spoken to somebody who's actually been sanctioned.
No, I didn't say that. I said that I didn't know.
You've not been able to cite any opportunities.
Hold on. Let's be accurate as to exactly what I just said. I said that I don't know whether the UC recipients that I have spoken to have necessarily been subject to a sanction or not. And in many of those conversations, frankly, I think it'd be rather indelicate to go into that kind of detail with those people. So that's quite distinct from saying that
I'm a constituency
I
MP.
never had. Yeah.
A constituency MP, and I meet people just about every week who've been subject to conditionality, and what a lot of them tell me is that being sanctioned pushes them into destitution. They have to be fed by the local food bank. They have to rely on the charity of people in their community. They experience mental health crisis as a result of that. May I gently suggest to you, Secretary of State, that if you're looking to get people back into work, plunging them into further poverty and destitution is not a particularly good way of doing that. I want to move on to the cost.
Can I just clarify that, David? I know you're the one to ask the questions, but just for the point of clarity,
yes.
Are you saying that we should not have any a sanctions regime at all? Are you saying scrap the whole thing?
I'm suggesting there's a much better way of doing things, and it seems to me like perhaps your understanding of sanctions is very theoretical and not actually based on how it interacts with people on the ground. And the fact that you've not been able to tell me today what your conversation with somebody who's been sanctioned has been like strikes me as being somewhat concerning. But I want to move on, Secretary of State, because I know that time is tight. The cost of living payment, if you've been sanctioned, you don't receive that. Does that therefore mean that people are being double punished?
There is, as I say, a hardship fund which is available. There is also a process that I've described which is very measured and very proportionate and does take into account the financial situation that somebody is in who may be sanctioned. It is the case that a sanction can be waived. There is no minimum amount that is required when it comes to sanctioning. So it is, I believe there is a system there which takes into account the circumstances of the individual involved and makes sure that a measured and proportionate approach is taken to sanctioning. And I do stand by the importance of having sanctions within the system, and I think it's very easy to stand on the outside and say, well, all these things are completely wrong about it.
You and I would disagree, in the fundamental approach on sanctions, right? We accept that and we put that to one side. But if someone has been sanctioned and the government has brought forward a very admirable aim to bring cost of living payments to help with the cost of living crisis, why should that person be double punished? Because the legislation that your government has brought through means that if someone's sanctioned, not only are they punished by way of a sanction, they also don't get the cost of living payment.
Okay, well, what I'm saying, just to repeat, is that what I think you're pointing to is there may be a situation where somebody is sanctioned, doesn't qualify for a cost of living payment arrangement, and thereby ends up in a very difficult financial position. And what I'm saying is that the system is designed so that end result should not occur. In other words, there are hardship payments available. There is a process which takes into account the situation that the individual is facing. There is an appeals process to an independent tribunal. There is the possibility of not applying a sanction at all under those particular circumstances. So I think that the safety net is built in to the system.
Well, I'm not sure that my caseload would build that in. Two further questions. The budget talks about a more intensive conditionality regime. What does that actually mean?
It means that we need to have something that's sufficiently applied and consistently applied across the piece. It doesn't mean any change in sanctions policy.
Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you. Good morning, Secretary of State. Can I just briefly go back to the questions that related to sanctions and just to gently ask you again what your evidence is that sanctions work?
So I've said that I'm very happy to write to the committee with an answer to that, but my view and the officials' view is that they are a necessary component of running a system that is effective at helping people into work. Okay. And I think there are very few out there, if I may say, who would argue that we need a regime that doesn't have any sanctions or conditionality.
What I asked, that's you're giving your opinion and also your officials' opinion in terms of what's reasonable. And I wouldn't disagree with you. As you rightly say, conditionality has been part of the social security system, since its inception. However, let me cite to you three pieces of evidence that you may want to refer to. First of all, in 2015, this Select Committee undertook an inquiry following on from the Matthew Oakley inquiry, which showed very clearly the issues that there are, particularly when they're applied to disabled people. 2016, the government's own behavioural insights team undertook a piece of work which showed, and I'm quoting here, and they are harmful and counterproductive. And then a long-term research project undertaken by several academic centres on welfare conditionality that also showed it is ineffective and it is harmful. So on that basis, and could I also mention that in the first year of its inception, 120 disabled people were sanctioned for 3 years. For 3 years. These are the extent of the sanctions regime that has been introduced. And you said, I think I'm quoting here now, there's no change to the sanctions policy. And during that first year, David Clapson, a veteran, he was sanctioned. He had diabetes, not something that would preclude somebody from work, and he was actively seeking work. He didn't have enough money to pay for his electricity, his fridge was shut off, and he died from diabetic ketoacidosis. These are the consequences. So in your response, I would like, and there are other examples I could give you, there are a list. In your response to this committee, would you provide an assessment of what you consider the impacts of reintroducing the harsh and severe sanctions regime that was introduced back in 2012? And include, please, your anticipation of deaths of claimants.
Okay, so, well, thank you for that. Perhaps I could start with the individual cases that you've referred to, Debbie. I clearly don't know all the details of those cases, so I can't comment on specifics, other than to say that there is nobody in DWP that I have met thus far, and I've met many hundreds, who has anything other than complete compassion and care as an attitude towards people in the kind of situation. Now, I think this is an important point to make, because it's very easy to characterise officials and ministers and so on when sanctions are being described and the effects of sanctions as somehow being heartless and uncaring, and that is most certainly not the case. In the research that you referred to there, the 2015, 16, etc., I think you used the expressions that some of that research had concluded that sanctions were, quote, harmful and counterproductive, and also
own behavioural insights
ineffective. Yeah, but they're the ones you chosen to highlight, and there are others, and I'll pass over to Catherine in a minute, who might be able to talk about others. But that, to me, comes back to the whole principle of sanctions, because if you're going to say that they are harmful and counterproductive, or indeed ineffective, that is an argument for not having them at all. And that's something that I think is wrong. And I'm not going to re-rehearse the arguments that I put earlier, but I think central to an arrangement where help and assistance is being provided, and as I said earlier, 97% of the cases in which sanctions are applied relate to somebody not turning up to a 10, 15-minute appointment with a work coach on a relatively, depending on which work group they're in, infrequent basis, with all the safeguards that I've described earlier. I think that is fundamentally the right system, but I'm not going to argue that it always is perfect on every single occasion. No operation of that scale ever, unfortunately, will be, and we must always try harder. But can I make just one other quick point?
Very briefly, because I'm conscious that there are other questions. Can I just refer you, because this does relate to the substantive question that I wanted to ask you. In the minutes of the serious case panel from last year, I looked this up last night in preparation of this. There is the minutes are scant, I have to say, and they're really, really disappointing. But on page 1, item 2.2, it says that we want to explore strengthening the mechanisms which protect our most vulnerable customers in respect of sanctions. What will those be? Given
to protect the
most vulnerable customers. What will those protections be?
Well, I think I've already set out the protections that there are in the system. So if somebody, say somebody misses an appointment, which, as I've explained, is not over 97% of the reason why sanctions are applied, and they had very good reason for missing that appointment. They may have suffered a bereavement in the family, they may have been attending a job interview, they may have had transport problems, who knows. But whatever those reasons, if they're reasonable reasons, then the expectation is that the work coach will certainly not entertain the idea of a sanction. In fact, they'd just simply be discussing, well, look, when can we next arrange a time when it's convenient to come in? If it were the case that somebody has on multiple occasions without any reason or good reason and was able to provide a reason and didn't turn up to appointments, then I think you start to get into the territory where the sanction regime may kick in. Now, in those circumstances, it is not the case of the work coach just saying, right, that's it, you're sanctioned. An approach is then made to an to an assessor, who then takes that decision, taking into account, amongst other matters, the financial situation of that individual, who is able to appeal that decision to an independent tribunal, and B, would have access potentially, for example, to the hardship fund or the flexible fund as well, in order to make sure that they're not put in a position where they're in absolute extremis. So I do think that within the way the system is designed and operates, there are appropriate protections in there.
I will refer back to the cases. I'll write to you directly, Secretary of State, about those, because I think those are very similar to the protections that were mooted back in 2012 on these punitive sanctions. Again, I think everybody here would agree conditionality has been at the heart of the welfare system. It is the punitive nature of the 2012 sanctions regime that was introduced that is so detrimental to vulnerable people especially, but to all people as well. People, their experience, they may not have a mental health condition when they start, but they certainly do in terms of the punishing regime that they are put through. Can I also raise another concern, and that is about the narrative that is being perpetrated over the last few weeks, which I thought and I'd hoped that we had seen the end of, really, that claimants are shirkers, that work shy. Ever thus in a population, there's always those that will try and buck the system, but the vast majority, first of all, have been in work. They have done the right thing. This is not a benefit. They've contributed to the system. This is the support that they get when unfortunately, because of our economy and other circumstances, they may not be allowed or able to work. So, having that, do you not think that language is and we've heard other sort of language that it's also very punitive. Do you not think that this language is detrimental to the claimants that we want to encourage to come into the job centre?
I totally agree that I think it's entirely wrong to demonise large numbers of people in the way in which I think you're suggesting may be happening. I think that is completely wrong. As to the point about looking after the most vulnerable in society, I am deeply proud of what this government has done through very difficult circumstances, both of the pandemic and of the consequences of the illegal war between Russia and Ukraine. I am the Secretary of State that took a decision to put benefits up by 10.1%. I'm the Secretary of State who decided to put pensions up by the same amount, raise the benefit cap by the same percentage. We are already now pressing the button on spending billions of pounds directing transfer payments to low-income households, many millions of them, 8 million low-income households, those that are disabled, pensioners up and down the country, to do what we can to get the most vulnerable through what is a difficult time, and no government would have found it an easy time. Okay. We're doing things on energy bills. Most of the average energy bill, 50% of that would have been paid by government support over the last winter. I really don't, if there's any premise here that this government doesn't care about the most vulnerable, judge us by our actions. And I think overall, most people looking at the evidence would say that we do just that.
Well, and I do congratulate you and commend you for that increase. But I do, again, I think we've discussed this before. It needs to be seen in the context of the last 13 years, 33 billion taken out of support for working age people. We had an academic who said that current levels of social security are at subsistence level. We're certainly one of the least generous in the EU 27 and in the OECD.
What's happened to poverty levels over the last 13 years?
Oh, please. I know you like to go on about absolute poverty, but in terms
of
relative
poverty, and children and workless households, they've all declined. And pensions, they've all declined.
I think we'd have to